Lincoln finally found his general. After years of trial and tribulations, he found Grant, who'd become General-in-Chief of all Union forces. Lincoln revived the symbolic rank of Lieutenant General, which was last held by George Washington. He bestowed that high honor onto Grant, who was given the monumental task of saving the Union. Upon Grant's promotion, he planned on briefly strategizing with President Lincoln, then returning out west to finish the war. But the troubling state of the Army of the Potomac compelled him to stay in the east. Grant decided to make his close friend and best general, William Tecumseh Sherman, his successor in the west. Grant, unlike many of his predecessors, looked at the war through a strategic lens. He believed the major failing of the Army of the Potomac was its inability to use its numerical superiority in men and material to grind down the Confederacy. After each battle, the Union Army would somehow retreat or allow the Confederates to regroup and consolidate. Grant decided to take a different approach. All Union forces in both eastern and western theaters would work in tandem to grind down the Confederates and prevent them from consolidating or shifting regiments to different regions. Grant first planned a naval invasion of 60,000 men in North Carolina, but changed his mind upon realizing that Lee would simply maneuver north. Grant wrote to Sherman, ordering him to commence the pursuit of Joe Johnston's army, which would be his objective point, and the heart of Georgia would be his ultimate aim. He directed General Sigels to move his army down the Shenandoah Valley and General Butler to reverse his army up the James River and stab straight at the Confederate capital of Richmond. The only thing left would be to decide whether to keep or replace Major General George Meade of the Army of the Potomac, the victor of the tide-changing Battle of Gettysburg. Meade received never-ending praise for winning the battle, but his failure to destroy Lee's army put him on thin ice with Lincoln. There was an open secret within the army that Grant intended to replace Meade with William F. Smith, who met with Grant at Brandy Station before Meade did. The general saw the writing on the wall. Meade later wrote to his wife, "As Grant is to be commander-in-chief and responsible for doings of the Army of the Potomac, he may desire to have his own man in command, particularly, as I understand, he is indoctrinated with the notion of superiority of the Western armies, and that the failure of the Army of the Potomac to accomplish anything is due to their commanders." Meade offered to resign during Grant and Meade's first meeting. Grant was taken aback. He fully intended on replacing Meade, but his humility made Grant change his mind. He later wrote, "That incident gave me an even more favorable opinion of Meade than did his great victory at Gettysburg." Grant then reassured Meade that he did not intend on replacing him. Grant also told Meade that he had no intentions of being a desk general. He would be in the field, shoulder to shoulder with the men. With Meade's position secure, he turned to face a litany of problems that desperately needed fixing. The army was on the verge of disaster. 3-year conscriptions had almost expired. Most of the men in the army fully intended on heading home and leaving the bloody war behind them. The War Department created several incentive programs to try and encourage the men to stay for another year. If the men re-enlisted, they would receive much deserved time off, along with a sum of money, around $700, which is worth around $12,000 today. The War Department made a guarantee to regimental commanders. They have 2/3 of the men in their respective regiments re-enlisted. They were able to keep their battle flags, and the men in the regiments would receive the honorary title of veteran volunteers. Stephen Sears and Lincoln's lieutenants said that the 30-day leave was the deciding factor for the men, not the money. Men all across the North heeded the call to arms from President Lincoln, who called for 500,000 men. The incentive program was effective, but also created a massive desertion problem, with new volunteers joining regiments and then leaving once they received the bonus money. The veteran volunteers nicknamed these men bounty jumpers. Attempts were made to try and counter these bounty jumpers, but they were mostly unsuccessful. Regimental commanders slowly learned to simply ignore them. Grant also went to work bringing in idle coastal garrisons from D.C. into the Army of the Potomac. These garrisons were fully equipped, well-fed, and trained in the art of artillery. Grant was the ultimate troubleshooter. He simply turned these massive units into infantry corps, incorporating them into the ranks, giving his army a distinct numerical advantage. Grant refused to exclusively rely on re-enlistments. He knew that some of the men were worn out from years of fighting. Grant believed it was about time for these garrisons to share in the suffering. Grant also brought Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps back from the west, which consisted of 20,000 men. Burnside refused to take orders from Meade, who he believed was inferior to him in seniority. Burnside would only take orders from Grant, which created massive problems later on. In the end, around 136,000 men re-enlisted, and 100,000 men decided to return home and leave the long war behind them. By the start of the Overland Campaign, Grant and Meade had around 102,000 men in combat roles. Grant decided to bring his old friend Philip Sheridan to take command of the cavalry. Sheridan was a stubborn 5'5" infantry general who fought with distinction out west. He would put teeth back into the lackluster Army Cavalry Corps, which was suffering ever since the loss of John Buford. Intelligence anticipated that Lee had around 90,000 men, but in actuality, Lee had around 65,000. Meade's intelligence anticipated French Louisianian General P.T. Beauregard's return from South Carolina, which inflated these numbers. Regardless, Grant and Meade were ready. They had what Sears called a new model army with high command, slimmed down and pruned of dead wood, political and otherwise. The South, on the other hand, was still plagued with political and military infighting, along with blatant incompetence. New recruits were hard to come by. Most of the men in the South were already serving. The Confederate Congress expanded the draft to 15 and 16-year-olds to try and help fill in the gaps. They also abolished regimental expiration dates. Soldiers were locked in till the war's completion. Food supplies were stretched to the limit. There was barely enough food to feed the small number of men and horses that remained in the ranks. Upon Lee's return from the North, he sent Lieutenant General James Longstreet out west, who was a tremendous aid to the Army of Tennessee at the Battle of Chickamauga. When Longstreet was out west, he lobbied Confederate President Jefferson Davis and Lee for 10,000 horses. He planned on converting his infantry to cavalry and burning the Louisville and Nashville Railroad in Kentucky. Longstreet believed that it would give the South some breathing room. He also suggested that all Southern armies should concentrate at one central point to reclaim lost territory, which would give them tactical superiority. P.T. Beauregard seconded the plan. Davis didn't like either general, so he gave the plan little credence. Lee liked the plan, but was concerned about leaving Richmond exposed to Grant. In the end, as Michael Korda put it in Clouds of Glory, the South simply relied on the old Army adage, when in doubt, do nothing. Instead, Lee prepared for Grant. This time, the Army of Northern Virginia would have the home field advantage. Lee's men were few in number, but were experienced in this new kind of warfare. Lee used the winter to reorganize his battered army, and by the time the Overland Campaign began, he was ready. Lee planned to fight defensively, which would put him on even footing with Grant. Most of Lee's army was comfortably situated in the wilderness located in northern Virginia. The wilderness was a dense forest, which was a perfect place to hide Lee's true numbers. Lee's army fought in the same location a year prior at the Battle of Chancellorsville. The Confederates won a stunning victory at the cost of Stonewall Jackson. These men also spent a significant time in the wilderness living off the land. They could navigate the forest with ease. Grant began his odyssey on May 4th. The other armies under his command would leave only days apart, with the last army to march out being Sherman's on May 7th. He told his men that he planned to hammer continuously against the armed forces of the enemy and his resources until, by mere attrition, if in no other way, there should be nothing left to him but equal submission of the loyal sections of our common country to the Constitution and laws of the land. The Confederates noticed an increased troop buildup, which started on May 2nd. Lee and his generals agreed upon not contesting the initial crossing. Lee knew he could not beat Grant in the open field due to their total superiority in numbers. Instead, he planned on luring Grant's army into the wilderness. The dense bottlenecks and tight trails would null the Union's superiority in numbers. The forest also shielded Lee's army from Grant's artillery, which he had in an overabundance. Grant took a step back and let Meade lead the army. Meade decided on repeating the same plan that he had used during the Battle of Mine Run. He planned once again to turn Lee's right flank and rear. The strategy also entailed pushing beyond the Mine Run defenses and quickly securing the wilderness. Meade hoped to engage Lee in a set battle beyond the forest in the open. Much like Sherman's march to the sea, Grant and Meade detached from their supply lines, ordering their men to take with them 10 days' worth of rations. They planned on opening a supply base at Fredericksburg. Throughout the campaign, Grant would establish an intricate web of supplies stemming from wagons, trains, and cargo ships. Cargo ships would become the ideal source of transportation because they could not be attacked by Confederate guerrillas, which raised havoc along the Union supply lines. Meade's men quickly marched to secure the Orange Turnpike and Orange Plank Road, which ran parallel to one another. Both roads led to the strategic cities of Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, respectively. The Union maps the soldiers used were of poor quality. It did not accurately show the western portion of the wilderness. Strategic locations that were marked on the map were miles apart from where they actually were. This led to mass confusion and chaos among the ranks. On May 5th, Warren's Corps was able to seize the vital Wilderness Tavern crossroad that ran down toward Spotsylvania Courthouse. Sedgwick's 6th Corps moved to hold Warren's right flank. Lee unleashed A.P. Hill's corps along with Ewell's corps to counter. Meade made the mistake of using one of Grant's Western commanders, James Wilson, to lead the cavalry screening instead of experienced cavalryman David Gregg. Meade did not validate Wilson's cavalry experience and simply trusted Grant's appointment. Wilson was not a cavalryman by trade, so he did a poor job at screening the enemy. Wilson's negligence let Ewell's corps march right up on Warren and smash into him, just as Lee intended. Meade was livid at Wilson's negligence. He quickly rode out to Warren's position after reading the shocking report. The two men had a brief meeting. Meade intended to have Warren stand his ground. Before leaving, Meade told the general, "If there's any fighting, this side of mine run. Let's do it right off." Meade then directed the army to converge on the Wilderness. During the opening battle of the campaign, Grant was at first hands off. He had no intention of directly leading the army. He told Meade that if an opportunity presents itself for pitching into a part of Lee's army, do so without giving time for dispositions. The turnpike turned into a seesaw action, with both sides fighting up and down the turnpike. By nightfall, the Union had the upper hand and was in a favorable position to smash into Lee's right flank the next day. Both sides went back to their respective camps and patted themselves on the back. Grant and Lee brought up their reinforcements. Grant would have Burnside's corps, and Lee would have Longstreet's. Ironically, both sides planned an attack at dawn in the same sector of the forest. Luckily for the Union, Longstreet was running late. Meade struck first at 5 a.m. The Federals gained a spectacular amount of ground in a short amount of time. They threw the Confederates back, driving them out of their makeshift earthworks. The Union pressed the attack, and by mid-morning they arrived at Lee's headquarters. Just as all was lost, Longstreet's Texans arrived. Lee drew his sword and planned on personally leading them into battle. The Texans refused and chanted, "Lee to the rear." Lee returned to his headquarters and met with Longstreet for one final time before he was wounded. Longstreet ordered his troops to march up an abandoned railway line that one of his men discovered. The railway line was unknown to Grant due to the terrible maps they possessed. Longstreet was able to break through the Union line, reversing their morning gains. Right as the North looked like they were going to break, Longstreet was wounded only a mile where his predecessor, Jackson, was, shot by his own men while scouting a year prior. Upon his wounding, the attack lost momentum. As word went down the ranks, some believed Longstreet was killed. While being carried away in a stretcher, Longstreet waved to his men and pleaded with them to finish the fight. Lee rallied Longstreet's men and ordered a counterattack at sunset, which captured 2 Union generals and forced the Union defenders from their fortifications. The fighting died out upon the outbreak of a forest fire, which ignited the Union breastworks. The soldiers on both sides withdrew in search of wounded comrades. Grant watched this battle in horror. His staff reported that he smoked more than 20 cigars throughout that day. During Lee's flank attack, a general rode up to Grant, panicking. He believed that Lee was on the cusp of encircling the entire army. This fear enraged Grant. He turned and faced the general and screamed, "Oh, I am heartily tired of hearing about what Lee is going to do. Some of you think he is suddenly going to turn a double somersault and land on our rear and both our flanks at the same time. Try to think about what we're going to do instead of what Lee is going to do." Grant then stormed off in a fit of rage. Grant told Lincoln before the upcoming campaign that whatever happens, there is to be no turning back, and Grant intended on keeping that promise. The Army of the Potomac suffered around 17,000 casualties, with 2,200 killed. The following day, Grant's army packed up and moved to Spotsylvania. The history books declare that both Grant and Lee are the winners of the battle. Lee won a tactical victory by inflicting 17,000 casualties on Grant, while Grant won a strategic victory for A, engaging Lee's army and inflicting 7,000 irreplaceable Confederate casualties, and B, maneuvering to Spotsylvania Courthouse and keeping Lee on the defensive. On May 7th, there was minor skirmishing on both sides. Grant at first thought of continuing the fighting in the Wilderness, but changed his mind and decided to press on Lee's right flank and try to get between Lee's army and Richmond by marching on Spotsylvania Courthouse. Grant planned on having his army withdraw during the dead of night so they could reach Spotsylvania Courthouse on the morning of May 8th. Lee anticipated this and directed his army to do the same. With Longstreet's medical condition unknown, the Confederate Corps commanders wondered who would succeed him. Lee decided to have the stoic Richard Anderson fill Jackson in Longstreet's shoes. Anderson made rapid progress during the night, working in conjunction with Jeb Stuart, who fought a delaying action. Meade led his army down to Spotsylvania Courthouse in tandem with Sheridan, who just returned from capturing Fredericksburg. Meade told Sheridan that you have sufficient forces on the approaches from the right to keep the Corps commanders advised in time of the appearance of the enemy. Sheridan planned on seizing the strategic bridges that led to Spotsylvania before the Confederates got to them. The oversight in the plan was Sheridan's failure to tell Meade about it. This created a massive traffic jam in the dead of night, with Warren's tired corps being scrambled in with Sheridan's cavalry. Meade was furious at the delay. He told a staff member that, "Never before did I see such slow progress made, certainly not half a mile an hour." This traffic jam cost the Union the race to Spotsylvania. Anderson was the first to reach Spotsylvania, and the victor gets the spoils. His men triumphantly dug in on the high ground on Laura Hill. By the time Meade reached Spotsylvania, Anderson was entrenched and ready to repel any attack. Meade got into a fight with Sheridan, who he rightfully blamed for losing the race. Sheridan requested a new assignment. Instead of working closely with the Army of the Potomac, he wanted to personally head out on an expedition to kill Jeb Stuart. Meade jokingly brought this plan to Grant, who took the suggestion seriously. Grant replied, "Did Sheridan say that? Well, he generally knows what he's talking about. Let him start right out and do it." Meade then met with Warren, who agreed that they should storm Laura Hill before Confederate reinforcements arrived. Warren attempted to dislodge the Confederates several times to no avail. His men were starving and exhausted from the night's march. Meade then brought Sedgwick's Sixth Corps forward to assist, but Warren was livid by his failure to take the ridges and took his anger out on Meade. The two of them had an argument, with Warren storming off. Instead of bringing insubordination charges on Warren, he let the general cool off. Meade understood that tensions were high and none of them had a proper night's sleep or meal in days. By May 9th, both armies started to arrive in force and dug in. Lee's army held a defensive ring around Spotsylvania, and Meade had his army dig in parallel to Lee's. Meade feared that Lee might break out and seize the recently captured city of Fredericksburg, which was turned into a supply depot. Grant arrived and took a more direct role. He ordered General Hancock to attempt to turn Lee's left flank, which did not have in-depth fortifications. Hancock left on May 9th and planned to attack on the morning of May 10th after he crossed the Po River. The attack was called off due to Lee committing his reserves, who reinforced the trenches overnight. Hancock withdrew, but left a small detachment of men to defend the bridgehead across the Po River. Later that day, Lee sent troops to destroy the bridgehead. Hancock's men barely escaped with their lives. Grant reorganized and planned on committing a frontal assault later that day. He planned on attacking in 3 different sections of the Confederate fortifications simultaneously. Meade planned on using an innovative strategy that was used during the Battle of Mine Run. He would use Emory Upton's rudimentary trench raiding tactic, which entailed a force being divided into 4 lines that would sprint to the enemy trenches with bayonets fixed. Only upon reaching the fortifications were they allowed to fire. The first line was meant to be the Meade shield that was supposed to soak up enemy fire. The second line was made to storm the gap, while the third and fourth lines were meant to reinforce and exploit the breakthrough. Upton would attack the famed Mule Shoe, which was a semicircle of trenches that could be attacked on all sides. Grant's attack failed due to poor coordination, which prevented him from winning the day. The only bright spot was that Upton's breakthrough was successful. The Confederate defenders were thrown back. Unfortunately, reinforcements did not arrive in time to help exploit the breakthrough, and Upton was forced to withdraw. Grant was impressed with Upton's tactics. He promoted him on the spot to brigadier general. The general-in-chief also planned for Upton to repeat the same attack the next day at dawn, but this time on a massive scale. On May 11th, the rains finally came and the heat wave ended. Both armies spent the day licking their wounds. Lee was displeased with the result of the campaign. He told A.P. Hill that night, "The army cannot stand a siege. We must end this business on the battlefield." not in a fortified place. While Grant and Lee were wrestling for the fate of America, Sheridan set out to do one thing: kill Jeb Stuart. After Meade and Sheridan's argument, Grant gave Sheridan permission for the expedition. Sheridan wasted no time. He took 10,000 men straight towards Richmond. Sheridan's logic was that Stuart would have to face him or he would burn the city. His column rode at a steady pace to preserve the horse's energy. Stuart followed, nipping at Sheridan's rear when he could. Stuart tried to reach the head of Sheridan's column in a vain attempt to stop him from burning down the vital supply hub at Beaver Dam Station. Sheridan sent George Custer ahead of the column. Custer set alight more than 1 million pounds of vital food that was in transit to Spotsylvania Courthouse. On May 11th, Stuart crashed into Sheridan's cavalry at Yellow Tavern. Sheridan had 10,000 men, while Stuart had a mere 4,500 men. On top of that, Sheridan's cavalry had lever-action rifles, a devastating combination. Stuart stood no chance. He was mortally wounded at the height of the fighting. Yellow Tavern was a turning point for the Army of the Potomac's cavalry. For the first time in 2 years, they won a decisive victory against the Confederate cavalry. After the battle, Sheridan kept moving south. He joked with the men, "What do you suppose we have in front of us? A lot of department clerks from Richmond who have been pressed into their ranks? I could capture Richmond if I wanted to, but I can't hold it. It wouldn't be worth the men it would cost." Historians today are very critical of Yellow Tavern. They view it as a hollow victory. Many believe that Grant foolishly threw away his cavalry, which could have been vital at Spotsylvania Courthouse. At dawn on May 12th, Upton attacked on schedule and took the Confederates by surprise. He used the rain and fog to shield his advance. The mule shoe was quickly overwhelmed, with hundreds of prisoners being taken. Lee made the mistake of withdrawing his artillery. He assumed that Grant was planning to make another attempt on his left flank. Lee committed his reserves and once again tried personally leading his men into combat. Lee's men were eventually able to push Upton's men out of the mule shoe. Lee's men didn't have bayonets or shoes. All they had was desperation. Grant believed that Lee was diverting troops from other parts of the front line in order to plug Upton's breakthrough. Grant ordered men to attack Laura Hill, believing that it was poorly defended. Grant was wrong. The attack failed. The day's fighting lasted over 14 hours, with the majority of the fighting being close quarters. The battle would later be called Bloody Angle. After the fighting, Grant took a step back and reassessed. He admired Lee's defenses and later wrote to his wife saying, "This world has never seen so bloody or so protracted a battle as the one being fought here, and I hope never again. The enemy was really whipped yesterday, but their situation is desperate. To lose this battle is to lose their cause, and as bad as it is, they fought for it with gallantry worthy of a better." Grant went to work reconstructing the army. He officially made Burnside subordinate to Meade. Burnside throughout the campaign had been lethargic and stubborn. He refused to take orders from Meade. In an attempt to compromise, Grant promised to be the only one delivering orders. In battle, this made matters confusing, which caused massive delays. Men in Grant's staff also believed that Grant should take over command from Meade so that the commanders got their orders directly from him. Grant was at first hesitant. He did not want to create further resentment in the ranks. He knew that the Army of the Potomac's high command resented his success, and he did not want to alienate Meade just yet. Overall, Grant's grand offensive was failing. Franz Sigels was defeated at the Battle of New Market. Benjamin Butler was trapped by P.T. Beauregard, who kept him in a bottleneck during the Burma 100 campaign. Both flanking operations had failed. Grant was alone, but he refused to give up. He told his men that he would fight Lee at Spotsylvania if it takes all summer. Grant attempted to bait Lee out of his defenses by moving on his left flank, thinking that it would bring him out of his horrid earthworks. Lee refused to take the bait. Once again, the Union was repulsed. Anticipating Grant's next move, Lee left his earthworks and moved his army behind the North Anna River. Grant followed in rapid pursuit. He did not want Lee to reach the Richmond defenses. Lee told Jubal Early, "This army can't survive a siege. If Grant crosses the North Anna River, it is only a matter of time." Lee once again beat Grant in a race across the North Anna River. Grant lost due to him not having his cavalry. Sheridan was still returning from his triumphant mission at killing Jeb Stuart. Lee raced across the North Anna River. His goal was to defend Hanover Junction, which linked Richmond to the Shenandoah Valley. On the march, Grant decided to merge Meade's command with his own. Grant wrote the orders, and his staff dispensed them. No longer would orders be delivered to Meade, who would in turn give them out to the army. From the looks of it, Meade was replaced, but in reality, Meade was still heavily involved in the planning process. The two of them would spend hours together, studying maps and reading reports. On the march, Meade advocated for crossing on the South Anna River. Instead, Meade was reluctant to send his troops against Lee's fortifications again. The men learned to fear fortifications. Governor Warren wrote to his wife that he wished for a battle in an open field without breastworks. On May 23rd, Warren's 5th Corps and Wright's 6th Corps crossed the North Anna River at Jericho Mills. Hancock's 2nd Corps crossed 5 miles downriver at Chesterfield Bridge. The steep natural banks at Jericho Mills prevented the Confederates from contesting the crossing. The crossing at Jericho Mills was shallow enough for the men to walk across. Upon reaching the other side, they dug in. Warren had his engineers build pontoon bridges for his artillery to come across. Burnside attempted to cross in the middle at Ox Fords. A.P. Hill raced the Jericho Mills and attacked in force in an attempt to throw Warren back across the river. Hill's attack lost momentum when Warren's artillery arrived across the platoon bridges the moment it was built. The cannons used canister shot on the advancing Confederates. A.P. Hill failed. Lee was furious. He sent a strongly worded message to Hill, asking, "Why did you not do as Jackson would have done? You should have thrown your whole force upon these people and driven them back." At Chesterfield Bridge, Hancock forced a crossing by bringing up his artillery, which eviscerated the Confederate defenses, and stormed across the bridge on the morning of the 24th. At Ox Fords, Burnside attempted another crossing but failed. This left Hancock and Warren open to being defeated in detail. Grant was now divided, stuck in another stalemate. Once again, Lee stopped Grant's offensive dead in its tracks. The general-in-chief called for a meeting with his other generals to discuss their next step. Grant and his fellow generals at first agreed on moving to Lee's right flank, bypassing him once more. Meade was against this, knowing that it would lead to more grinding against fortifications. Instead, he advocated for a crossing 30 miles south. Grant was at first against this, but realized that any movement would lead to his army being flanked. Grant gave the order to withdraw, slowly and methodically. Sheridan finally returned to the army on May 24th and was immediately put to work. Grant ordered him to have his cavalry dismount and fake a right flank maneuver. Meade was relieved that Grant finally listened to him, but he feared that he would never get the recognition that he rightfully deserved. Meade later wrote to his wife that no dispatches mention my name. Future historians collecting official documents to compile a thorough view would absolutely not know from any evidence Grant's dispatches contain that I was even present with the army. The media made Meade the army's scapegoat. Any conceivable setback was blamed on him. One newspaper accused Meade of begging Grant to order a retreat across the Rapidan during the opening days of the campaign. The false story spread like wildfire throughout the country. Grant defended his general, stating that on no occasion advised or consulted falling back towards, much less across, the Rapidan. Any rumors otherwise are entirely idle and without the shadow of foundation. During the campaign, Meade proved himself to be an indispensable general. Without him, Grant's grand offensive would have surely failed. Meade knew how to navigate the dense bureaucracy of the Army of the Potomac, along with knowing its strengths and weaknesses of his corps commanders. But most importantly, he knew Lee. He bested the Southern general at Gettysburg. Meade knew when to fight and when to withdraw. His pragmatism complemented Grant's stubbornness. Lee moved parallel to Grant. Lee put Hampton Wade III in charge of Stuart's cavalry. Hampton's orders were to screen Grant's movements with an emphasis on finding out his overall objective. Sheridan returned just in time to lead the general advance. Grant's army marched in a broad, sweeping front. Hampton crashed into Sheridan at Hayes' Shop, a vital crossroad. The fighting was bloody. Sheridan had his men dismount so they could use their lever-action rifles effectively. Hampton's men did not have the same luxury. They fought the best they could behind barricades, with old muskets, pistols, and shotguns. The fighting lasted for some time. Eventually, Hampton surrendered the field once he figured out the true intentions of Grant's movements. Upon receiving Hampton's intelligence report, Lee swung at the Union Army while it was on the march. Lee stabbed at Warren's 5th Corps, who was making a stand at Bethesda Church. The Pennsylvania Reserve divisions were caught off guard. For them, the war was only 2 days away from ending. Their 3-year enlistments were just about up. The men's attitude was relaxed and sloppy. The Confederate infantry quickly rolled through their ranks, creating a rout. Warren personally rode up with his artillery to save the day. His cannons fired into the advancing enemy ranks at close range, bringing the Confederate assault to a screeching halt. Grant shifted left once again in an attempt to lure Lee out of his defenses. This time, Grant would draw upon idle troops from the failed Burma 100 front. They would smash into Lee's southern flank at the crossroads of Cold Harbor. While Grant and Meade were working out the finer details, they received news that Sheridan had already taken the crossroad. Sheridan had his men dig in. They were numerically outnumbered, but they had their lever-action rifles. Sheridan fought off several waves of infantry assaults that would have overwhelmed the typical soldier equipped with muskets. Sheridan's news caused Grant to change plans. He ordered Wright's 6th Corps to swing around to the left flank during the dead of night to save Sheridan. Then together, they would crash into the Confederates at dawn on June 1st. This plan failed. Wright's corps got lost during the night due to Cold Harbor having several different names. He reached Sheridan late in the morning and did not attack till 6 that evening. They attacked to no avail. A minuscule amount of ground was taken. Lee was dug in. Every moment Grant was not attacking gave the Confederates vital time to dig in. Upton said the fighting was a murderous engagement. I say murderous because we are recklessly ordered to assault the enemy's entrenchments, knowing neither their strength nor position. Meade was enraged that once again the Confederates were set and dug in. Grant arrived at the Union entrenchments. He originally planned on ordering another assault at dawn on June 2nd, but after reviewing the poor state of the army, decided to postpone the attack to the next day. At dawn on June 3rd, Grant threw everything he had at Lee in a vain attempt to exploit the small breakthroughs that Wright had made. The men in Grant's ranks knew it was futile. Some wrote their names and pinned them on their uniforms so they could be identified among the dead. Other veterans ran halfway across the killing ground and then lay down behind some kind of cover and took pot shots at the trenches, refusing to move forward. At dawn on June 3rd, the attack failed as quickly as it began. During the fighting, Lee was touring the fortifications with Confederate congressmen. Lee was lobbying for reinforcements that he desperately needed. He ironically used Grant's attack as an example of how outnumbered they were. 3,500 more men were added to the long list of casualties. Grant would later say, "I have always regretted that the last assault at Cold Harbor was even made." Meade later wrote that I think Grant has had his eyes opened and is willing to admit now that Lee's army is not Bragg's army. Thus ended the Overland Campaign. Grant and Lee remained in their trenches for an extended period of time. A truce was arranged and the dead were collected. The smell was horrid. Confederate soldiers joked that Grant was trying to stink us out. Lee was vigilant. He knew Grant was going to once again push forward. The Southern general planned for his men to attack the moment Grant left his fortifications. Grant was horrified about the result of the campaign, but kept his promise to the president. Whatever happens, there would be no turning back. The Army of the Potomac moved once again, this time to Petersburg and the gates of Richmond itself.